Welcome everyone to this FWR webinar, Protecting Scotland's Groundwater Quality. This is an FWR webinar, or the Foundation for Water Research, who is an independent community of professionals from across the water sector and related scientific specialisms. The community comes together for deliberative discussion to support the development of interdisciplinary solutions to water challenges. Once we get started, I'll share a link in the chat where you can sign up to the free FWR newsletter to stay up to date with their work and find out more about them. But in the meantime, we're really pleased today to be joined by our speaker, Isla Smale. Isla is a principal hydrogeologist in the Scottish Environment Protection Agency's Water Resources team. She is a chartered geologist and has over 25 years of experience in regulation and consultancy, both in the UK and overseas, and her current work focuses on issues relating to groundwater contamination. As usual, at the end of Isla's presentation, we will have some time for Q&A, and you can submit any questions you have at any point during the presentation using the little Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and I will then read these out on your behalf later on. Thank you so much, Isla, for joining us today. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ethne. So as Ethne said, I'm Isla Smale. I'm one of SEPA's principal hydrogeologists. Forgive my voice, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold, so I'm a little bit croaky, but it should make it through today without any problems. So without any more ado, I'm just going to crack on with the presentation. So Scotland has new groundwater quality standards, and we've also got new guidance to go along with those standards. So this is just an update on those new standards and our guidance. This will be very familiar to many of the people on the call if you participated in the joint SEPA Scottish Government consultation that was held back in 2021. Today I'm just going to focus on some of the key changes in the guidance. A lot of the guidance is the same as it was previously, but there are some key changes, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. When you look at the documents, they may look very different to what you're maybe used to, because they have been reorganized and reformatted, but a lot of the technical detail is the same as before. So the changes are maybe appear more at first glance than they actually are in reality. So why are the new standards come about? So the Scottish Government has issued new directions late last year. So there are two sets of directions, one on standards and one on status. And then there are two sets of each of those, one for the Scotland River Basin and one for the Solway-Tweed River Basin. Although there's two sets for the different river basins, that's just a reflection of the way that RBMP works in Scotland. The numbers are the same from both. It's important to note that those directions do cover more than just groundwater, but it's only the groundwater aspects that I'm going to be focusing on today. So those directions are on the Scottish Government website if you wish to take a look. So based on those directions from the government, we have updated our guidance. In particular, we've updated our SEPA guidance on assigning groundwater assessment criteria for pollutant inputs, which is more commonly referred to as WAT PS10. So now we have WAT PS10-02. We've also updated our guidance on land contamination and impacts on the water environment. That was previously informally referred to within Scotland as the Brown Booklet, despite not having been brown or a booklet for many years. But that guidance has also been updated. To accompany, to accompany WAT PS10-02, we have also published a list of new groundwater standards for which include suggested values for a wide range of common contaminants of concern. This used to be included within WAT PS10, but we have separated it out into a standalone document that is a sort of sister document to WAT PS10 now. And that means that we can update it as and when required more readily. For example, were a new drinking water standard to be published. So when do these new standards and guidance apply? They apply to all sectors. They apply at all stages of the project life cycle, from planning and permitting through to surrender. and they also apply to historical land contamination associated with past activities. They're really most relevant for situations when you're having to do a detailed hydrogeological risk assessment. That's when you're most likely to need to refer to the guidance. So the guidance focuses on groundwater quality and risks to the water environment from groundwater quality issues. The supporting guidance also covers land contamination risks to the water environment. The guidance doesn't cover radiological risks to the groundwater environment. However, some of you may be interested to know that SEPA do currently have a consultation open at the moment. It's on our website regarding groundwater input standards in relation to radiological contamination. So you may want to go and take a look at that. The guidance also doesn't cover groundwater resource aspects in relation to groundwater levels, water scarcity or drought. It doesn't cover surface water risks except those that apply via the groundwater pathway. So it covers groundwater base flow, but it doesn't cover other overland routes to surface waters. And the guidance on land contamination only relates to the water environment. It doesn't cover human health or property. So really, we're focusing on groundwater quality here today. And I'm going to focus primarily on WPS 1002, because that is the that's where the changes are more significant for practitioners. So WPS 1002, it sets out our legislative objectives for groundwater quality in Scotland. It provides guidance on how you select relevant groundwater quality standards for use in your assessments. And it provides some general overarching guidance on how to assess risks to groundwater and groundwater dependent receptors. It is overarching general guidance. It is not sector specific. So it's a general approach. You may need to modify your approach for specific regimes. But this gives you a flavour of how to set any sector-specific or site-specific requirements in a sort of broader framework. And our guidance also provides guidance on next steps if it's not going to be feasible to meet the groundwater objectives in full. The overall approach to risk assessment in our guidance is very similar to what we had previously. It's a phased approach. It uses a source pathway receptor framework. The level of detail required will reflect the level of likely risk and the complexity of your site. The approach in terms of like how you might set up a groundwater numerical model doesn't change significantly. It's really the changes relate primarily to the assessment criteria you might use. So what are our objectives for groundwater quality? So the first objective is to control inputs of hazardous substances. This used to be to prevent inputs of hazardous substances, but that wasn't really reflective of what was actually happening in practice. And so we've amended the wording slightly to better reflect what is actually happening in kind of day-to-day practice within Scotland. The second objective is to limit the inputs of non-hazardous substances such that they don't result in contamination of the water environment. To prevent deterioration in groundwater body or surface water body status. To return groundwater bodies to good status where that's feasible to do, and to prevent direct discharge to groundwater of hazardous or non-hazardous substances. So these 5 objectives are what SEPA use when we undertake regulatory decision-making. They're also applicable to sites regulated by other parties, for example, local authorities in relation to sites being redeveloped through the planning system. So we're trying to achieve these 5 objectives. So the standards we might use to do that, so there's 3 main categories of groundwater standards. The first is the input standard for hazardous substances. And this is a standard you would use where you might previously have used a minimum reporting value, or MRV. And in this case, groundwater itself is the receptor, and that's irrespective of its resource potential. Then we have pollution standards and status standards. And these primarily apply to non-hazardous substances. However, they can also be applied to hazardous substances if those substances have already entered groundwater due to historical land contamination. And the standards for pollution and for status are set for groundwater resources, but also for groundwater dependent receptors. So the groundwater dependent receptors include abstractions, surface waters, groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems. So these are all considered as part of the water environment. Note that in Scotland we don't use the term controlled waters, we use the term water environment. It's an equivalent term. So for hazardous substance, we have our input standards as our primary tool, and these are a twin system of standards depending how close you are to surface waters. In either case, they're assessed at the base of the unsaturated zone, so that's prior to entry into groundwater, so you cannot take dilution into account. The standards are assessed as an annual average, and they're either based on potable standards or surface water standards, depending on whether you're close to surface waters. What would you do if you had a source zone that straddled that 50-meter boundary line? So you had a source that was partly 50 meters with less than 50 meters from a river and partly more than 50 meters. Well, you could either zone your source term in your assessment and then assess each part of the source separately, or you could pick the lower of the 2 values and apply that across the whole source zone as a simpler but slightly more conservative approach. The input standards for hazardous substances apply to all groundwater onshore, so that's above mean high water springs, and that is less than 400 meters deep. For groundwater that is more than 400 meters deep or that is offshore of mean high water springs, the standards may still apply if the groundwater in question is fresh or there is a plausible route to surface ecosystems. So those are the input standards, but really in any case where you would have previously used an MRV, now you would use your input standard. So that's the prime difference. The next category of standards are the pollution standards. These apply to non-hazardous substances, or as I've mentioned, and they would also apply to hazardous substances that are due to historical contamination where the entry to groundwater has already happened. And the main change here is with respect to future groundwater resource. This is the main change. The other 3 pollution standards are broadly similar to what we had before, but the change is for future groundwater resource, where we've gone from a distance-based standard and now we have an area-based standard. So the pollution metric here is an area of more than 1 hectare is considered to be pollution of future groundwater resource. And the assessment criteria here is the threshold value, and again assessed as an annual average. And I do have some content a bit later on about averaging, just to provide a little bit of an extra steer on that. And then for groundwater status standards, again, these are for non-hazardous substances or for hazardous substances due to historical contamination. And again, the main change we have here is in relation to future groundwater resources. So now we have a status metric, which for hazardous substances is set at 20 hectares, and for non-hazardous substances is assessed across the groundwater body. Note Scotland's smallest groundwater body is 1.7 kilometres squared. There is a screening criteria in our guidance for as an initial rule of thumb to assess against 200 hectares, but that's just a sort of screening criteria that wouldn't have any formal weight per se. Again, it's the threshold value and an annual average metric that would be used. The other slight change is in relation to groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems. So now for status, these are only designated sites, so SSSIs or Natura 2000 sites, whereas for pollution, it's any groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystem. So that's a slight change. Probably not a huge change in practice for many practitioners. So we've got our list of standards, and as I mentioned previously, we have published a list of standards for common contaminants, and the list indicates whether those substances are hazardous or non-hazardous, whether the value of the relevant standard that you could use and where that comes from. And if you're looking at a contaminant that isn't on the list, it's a very long list, but it's quite possible that you'll have a contaminant that isn't on it. You can always go back to the methodology that's set out in the Scottish Government directions and use that to derive a relevant standard for your site. We haven't set numerical criteria for heat or for microbiology because these are very site specific, but the assessment here would be whether any anthropogenic changes in groundwater would cause adverse effects on groundwater dependent receptors in relation to heat or microbiology. So I'm just going to cover now the area-based standards because that's the real shift. So the area-based standards for future groundwater resource are the area of both your source and your plume. It's 1 hectare for the pollution standard, or 20 hectares for status if it's a hazardous substance, or the groundwater body if it's a non-hazardous substance. It's based on a plan view, simplified view of plumes. So it's a 2-dimensional area, and it is your maximum expected plume extent. So it's not necessarily your current plume extent, but it's the maximum you think the plume will achieve. And the edge of the plume is set as where the concentration is equal to the threshold value. In order to be able to assess this, you are going to have reasonable characterization of your source geometry. And you'll need to think about how your plume might evolve given your hydrogeological setting. You might also need to consider the potential for cumulative effects if you have multiple sources of the same contaminant in the same area. Rule of thumb here would be if your predicted plumes from those multiple sources would potentially overlap, then perhaps you should be considering them as a cumulative combined source. So that's the kind of basis for the area-based standard. I do have a little worked example later on to kind of explain this a little bit more. We appreciate that some software that's out in the market or is commonly used, and also the equations for doing hand calculations, if that's your preference, are based on a 2-dimensional cross-sectional approach. And so we do allow the use of equivalent assessment distances instead of the area metric. And these are calculated on a site-specific basis by dividing the spatial metric, so whether that's the 1 hectare or the 20 hectares, by the source zone width in meters, perpendicular to the groundwater flow direction. We have set some caps on the maximum equivalent distance that we'll accept, and that's 500 meters for pollution and 4 kilometers for status. I would say in Scotland, 4 kilometers within an aquifer is sometimes, it's not that common. Our aquifers do tend to be comparatively small. We have lots of surface water features. We have lots of topography to consider. So 4 kilometers, it's going to be a comparatively unusual situation before you would hit another receptor. And the really important thing to remember about equivalent assessment distances are these are measured from the up gradient boundary of the source. So rather than the previous approach, where the assessment distance was measured from the down gradient boundary, now it's from the up gradient boundary, because we want to take the footprint of the source term itself into account. So that's a really important distinction to note if you're using equivalent assessment distances. Another key change in the guidance is the background concentration approach. So the assessment criteria for use in risk assessment are fixed unless you can demonstrate that your up gradient concentrations are naturally elevated. So where there's background contamination but it's anthropogenic, that can't be taken into account when setting your criteria for use in your risk assessment. Now, we recognize that this is more conservative than our previous approach. However, it does align better with the approach that's used for surface waters. It allows us to more effectively account for cumulative pressures. And particularly for new activities, it may mean there's a requirement for additional treatment or mitigation prior to discharge or placement of materials. There's no requirement or expectation for historical contamination that you would have to remediate groundwater entering your site. You're only responsible for what is within your control. However, although the risk assessment criteria are fixed, the background concentrations can be taken into account if you're setting compliance targets or validation criteria for your site. Similarly, limits of detection can be taken into account in your compliance criteria, and your compliance criteria can be site-specific. They can even be borehole-specific, according to your existing conditions. Sorry, excuse me 1 second. So our annual average concentrations metric, this is particularly relevant to current or future activities, such as discharges to land, and it allows for some minor short duration temporal variation in a source to be accommodated more readily without compromising the long-term risks to groundwater. It is also relevant when you're thinking about your conceptual site model or when you're undertaking DQRA. For example, if you're looking at a readily degradable contaminant, how might that vary over time if it's a very short half-life? Or if you're thinking about entry into groundwater, you might think about your variation in your thickness of your unsaturated zone over the seasonal variation in that. However, when you're averaging, particular care is required if your data set is very small or if it contains potential outliers or significant trends. And the important thing I would really like to stress here is the importance of showing you're working. If you're doing averaging, make sure you document any assumptions and highlight any areas of uncertainty when you're undertaking those calculations. A new requirement in the guidance is to consider climate change and extreme events. This is primarily within your conceptual site model. Are there additional or altered pollutant linkages that might apply in the event of climate change, or depending on climate change influences on your site, and in the event of an extreme event? Are there linkages that only apply during extreme events and don't apply under typical conditions? And the influence that climate change and extreme events will have will depend on the timescales you're considering for an activity, or for depending on the persistence of a contaminant. And it also depends on the sensitivity of a site and its hydrogeological setting. So, for example, a coastal site will be more influenced by sea level rise than an inland site. That's common sense. So, do you think about it within your CSM? During your DQRA, you might want to think about undertaking some sensitivity analysis to account for any parameters that might significantly alter in the future or during an extreme event. If you don't think it's relevant, that's then explain why you don't think it's relevant. We do have exemptions from meeting the groundwater objectives. It's not always feasible to meet the groundwater objectives in full at every site. It's really important to note that the legal basis for exemptions has not changed. Our guidance has been amended slightly, but the legal basis and if you go back to the legislation, there is no change to the criteria to which exemptions can be applied. Some key points to note on exemptions are that disproportionate cost can only really be applied to historical land contamination. And another key point is that even if it's not feasible to meet groundwater objectives in full, that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be feasible to meet objectives partially. So that needs to be, we're looking for betterment. So we need you to get as close to the objectives as possible, recognizing that it may not be 100% possible in every single case. The relevant regulator, whether that's SEPA or the local authority or the Scottish Government, will need to agree to the exemptions, and the use of the exemptions needs to be transparent and justified in sort of documentation. Applicants are encouraged, if they want to ask a regulator to consider an exemption, to provide site-specific reasons as to why they think it would be applicable. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of short examples. So the first is a historical example of so it's a DNAPL contaminations of trichloroethylene, or TCE. We have a small source of DNAPL-free product that is around 25 meters diameter. And then we have a resultant groundwater plume that includes the degradation products of TCE, so DCE and vinyl chloride. In this example, we're really focusing on the future groundwater resource test, so there aren't any groundwater dependent receptors nearby. The reason I'm focusing on the resource test is that's the test that has changed. So your first kind of question is, has there already been entry into groundwater? Has that DNAPL already reached groundwater? Unless there's some form of barrier, that is probably going to be the case. But you need to consider that in your site characterization. Our source area is less than a hectare, but obviously when we're looking at our pollution metric, we need to consider both the source and the plume. So in this case, we think we have entry. The groundwater has already been impacted, is from a historical source of contamination. So we're looking at our pollution metric. So here we take our 1 hectare or 10,000 square meters and divide that by the source width, which is 25 meters, and that would give you 400 meters equivalent assessment distance. For our status test, you take your 20 hectares or 200,000 square meters, again divided by your source width. That would give you 8,000 meters, but remember there is a 4-kilometer cap in place. We think our plume is actually going to be 500 meters from the upgradient boundary of the source to the final maximum extent of the plume. So in this case, for the future resource test, we do have entry to groundwater occurring. We're failing the pollution test, but we're not failing the status test. So what might you do in this scenario? It might not be technically feasible to achieve 100% removal of the NAPL to prevent entry occurring, but you might be able to remove enough such that you could shrink the plume sufficiently such that it wouldn't fail the pollution test. And that might be a reasonable remedial objective to aim for. Our second example is for a proposed discharge to land. In this case, it's trade effluent, and the effluent contains copper and benzoate pyrene going into a soakaway. Firstly, do we have a direct discharge into groundwater? That's not normally acceptable. It creates a pollutant risk. Even if the effluent is acceptable under normal circumstances, it still creates a preferential pathway were there to be a leak or a spill, for example. For our hazardous substance, so our benzoate pyrene, we would assess the effluent concentration against the input standard in the first instance. If it passes, then great. If it doesn't, then you could look at whether the thickness of the unsaturated zone is sufficient to attenuate that sufficiently, such that entry wouldn't occur. For our copper, our source area is less than the 1 hectare, but the plume is obviously needs to be considered as well. Again, we're taking our 10,000 square meters, dividing that by our source width, and that would give 1,000 meters. But there is a 500 meter cap, remember, for pollution. Status here would be the groundwater body, but there is a sort of screening test of using 200 hectares. Dividing that by your source width would give you 200 kilometers. But remember, there is a 4-kilometer cap. 200 kilometers would obviously not really work in Scotland anyway, given our geography and geology. So in this case, we think our plume from the upgradient end of the source is going to be around 250 meters. So we're well below the pollution threshold. So provided we can meet those standards, then the discharge could be authorised. If we weren't going to meet these standards, or if there were significant upgradient groundwater contamination issues to take into account, then we might be looking for some form of pre-treatment prior to the discharge. As I mentioned previously, but I'm not going to cover it in any detail here, we have updated our guidance on land contamination and impacts to the water environment. This does apply only to historical land contamination. It doesn't apply to current or future activities. The guidance covers both planning and Part 2A, and it does include a checklist of supporting information that is pertinent to contaminated land assessment. We do have some guidance on our website regarding the transition. So the new standards came into force at the beginning of February. We're in a transition period now until the beginning of July. And during this transition, you can use either the old approach or the new approach, depending on your preference. The new approach is most applicable to new applications or new permit variations. Where sites are already authorised or remedial strategies already been agreed, then the new standards may be applied if that is agreed by all parties, but it will be on a site-by-site basis, depending what is practical, reasonable, and best for the environment as a whole. We're not necessarily going to retrospectively apply the new standards to existing authorizations. So just to sum up, the new standards and our guidance is now live. We're trying to achieve the groundwater objectives or as close to them as we can. The key change in our approach is the assessment of risks to future groundwater resources, to that spatial metric. It's really important to have a good conceptual site model that includes your source, your plume, that includes potential influence over time in relation to climate change. And you'll need a good level of site characterization in order to understand your source term and your plume dynamics. Exemptions are going to be possible in some scenarios, but do require justification. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and hand you back to Ethne.
Thank you so much, Isla. That was a really useful overview of the updates to the guidance and great to see some worked examples as well of that in practice. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to kick straight off into the Q&A session now. Thanks to those of you who've put questions in already. We'll get through as many as we can. And then if there are any others, we can always see if we can follow up with those afterwards. So I guess the first question, Isla, is are there other kind of related guidance updates that are on the horizon for SEPA? And in particular, an attendee's asked whether there's going to be updated government directions for coastal and transitional waters.
I'm not aware of any that are imminent in relation to coastal or transitional waters. It's not my area of work, however, so I'm not sure if there's any in the sort of medium to long term horizon, but in the short term, I'm not aware of anything sort of coming this year, as it were. The things that are on the horizon, as I say, we had a consultation open at the moment regarding radiological risks to groundwater, so that is out at the moment. JAGDAG also have a consultation at the moment regarding determination of a new batch of substances in regard to whether or not they're classed as hazardous to groundwater. And depending on the results of that JAGDAG consultation, SEPA would then implement those determinations into our own standards. So that I think that probably be summer or autumn that might kick through. And then the other thing to watch on, there's a lot of movement in relation to our regulatory regimes within SEPA at the moment. So there are various consultations, some that have just closed, others coming soon regarding the integrated authorization framework and the transition to the ESER regime for CAR and PPC and WML. So for people with operational or authorized sites, then they might want to keep an eye on the consultations that we have, because there will be several over the course of this year on that.
That's great. Thank you, Isla. And in one of the examples you talked about, the one to do with DNAPL, someone's asked, would there be an expectation that the DNAPL source would be remediated to control ongoing entry of hazardous substances, even if the pollution test was not failed?
We would like to see as much removal as possible. So efforts made to remove as much as possible, but we recognize that getting 100% of DNAPL out may not be technically feasible. So we would like to see efforts in that direction, but we appreciate that it may not be 100% achievable. So betterment is always what we're looking for in that kind of scenario.
That's great. Thank you. And are you able to define, so you mentioned kind of historical source of pollution in the groundwater environment. Are you able to define historical in this context? And where a site owner is assessing or remediating a site voluntarily, and an exemption might be requested, will SEPA be in a position to respond to what could conceivably be a significant number of submissions per annum?
So if you're undertaking work voluntarily and you don't require an authorization and you don't require planning permission, then you don't need an exemption. It's at your own risk as to how you approach that. If you require an authorization or if it requires planning permission, then that's when exemptions would need to be considered. But if it's voluntary work, then it wouldn't require formal agreement of an exemption. That would be a commercial risk as to whether you wish to assume that exemption would be forthcoming were the site to go through the regulatory regime in the future.
Great, thanks. And on that point around kind of defining historical, do you have anything to add on that point?
Okay, so anything that happened prior to Part 2A coming out, that was 1990, that would definitely be historical. Anything that's happened since CAR came into force in 2011 would definitely not be historical. For between 1990 and 2011, it does depend on the regulatory regimes that would have applied at your site. So if it was a WML site or a PPC site, then there may be other criteria in play. So it would be on a site-specific basis. But yes, anything before 1990, I think we're happy to consider that historical. But anything since CAR came into force, then where we could still take enforcement action under CAR, then that wouldn't be considered historical.
Thank you. And you mentioned the point around kind of looking at different standards for hazardous and non-hazardous substances, and there were a few which didn't have those kinds of standards in place at the moment. Could you give a little bit of an overview of some of those that might be missing? And in particular, there's a question here around whether there are any updates to groundwater standards for emerging contaminants, so things like PFAS and PFOA.
So PFAS, we do have standards for PFAS that are based on the Scottish potable standards for PFAS. So that there's, which is for 20 PFAS substances. It's not all PFAS, it's only 20 specific compounds. Beyond that, for the rest of the PFAS suite, because obviously it's thousands of compounds, you could always apply the approach that's set out in the Scottish Government directions, or depending on your site, if you had a mixture of PFAS, you could use an indicator compound approach, depending on whether that would be appropriate. So that might be a situation to discuss with the relevant regulator, whether that's SEPA or the local authority, as to what might work best for your particular site. For other emerging contaminants, obviously there are tens of thousands of chemicals on the market. We cannot set standards for all of them, and nor do we really need to, because they don't come up necessarily frequently. But the methodology is set out in the directions. If your contaminant isn't on the list, then you can use the methodology and directions to derive a standard for your site or for a particular contaminant.
Great, thank you, Isla. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in terms of questions today. Sorry if I didn't get to yours, but I will pass them on. So potentially we can revisit those. So thank you so much for putting them in, and thank you so much, Isla, for presenting today and taking the time to join us. It's massively appreciated. As usual, this webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on the IES YouTube channel. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. And if you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar using our CPD tool, and you can find this by logging into the IES members area of the website. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar and you're not a member, please do consider joining the IES. The next FWR webinar will be held on the 18th of March, and this is on planning citizen science monitoring of rivers, and you can register for this both on the FWR and IES websites. For now, a massive thank you to you, Isla, and for all our attendees for taking part. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.